can I just say, as an observer from the floor, that this session so far today has been wonderful. The bringing together of various different people from a number of different countries across the region. I've been really surprised and enjoying the session, and I hope that we'll be able to continue that throughout this particular panel and the next before lunch. I was going to introduce our panel speakers in a moment, but this session is particularly interested in the infrastructure sector and specifically those dealing with transport, so ports, roads, rail, and air. And I think I bring myself back to a comment that has been made in the past to say that the continent is often referred to as a continent of hope. And I think that a better connected continent with infrastructure is a very good way of helping to achieve that. It has a number of opportunities as well as challenges. First of all, I thought it would be helpful to open up to the panel for each of the panel members to mention a little bit about what they do and the context so that what they can bring to this panel today. So first of all, over to Andrew from BuroHappold.
Thank you. Do we have any microphones? Hello. My name is Andrew Cohen. I'm a partner at a consultancy called BuroHappold. We're a British company with an international outreach. My background is civil engineering. I've been in that profession for, unfortunately, over 4 decades now, and the last 2 decades of that, most of the focus that I've been having is on urban development, on the growth of cities, on the need for cities to grow sustainably. So whether it's new cities or regeneration of cities. And I've also been intrigued by the opportunity that technology offers in terms of our ability to start tackling some of the major challenges that we face, not only now but in the future, in terms of climate change, depletion of natural resources and so on. So I think I don't have a great experience of the Latin American region. BuroHappold doesn't. We've worked in about half a dozen of the countries, and a lot of that work has been mainly providing advice to international funds and investors who are looking to invest in infrastructure, producing risk-based reports and future forecasting models to help them make their investment decisions. And we have undertaken some planning and design work, but I think historically, certainly from our profession, from our perspective, the cultural and the language challenges have meant that we've focused to date in other parts of the world. But I think we've been investigating the opportunities and looking at the interesting growth and the growing importance of the region, and I'm very confident that in the future we'll be working there. I certainly hope we will be. Maybe not quite in my remaining years in the career, but doing a lot of work out there.
Thanks, Andrew. And Gershon was speaking before, but obviously this is right, full frontal and centre for the work that you do on the infrastructure funds.
Full frontal has a very different meaning, and that's something you're not going to see. In relation to what I spoke about before, I did it in the context of my organisation, which is a worldwide investor in all manner of areas and asset classes. My focus over the last 20 years was to build a capability in one niche area of infrastructure. So whilst I'm familiar with all the areas of infrastructure, what I spend most of my time on is the niche area of public-private partnerships. I'm drawn to that because I'm an extraordinarily patient person. It is one of the areas of commerce which is you have to be very patient in the private sector if you want to actually make money from a strategic relationship and long-term partnership with government. However, we saw that opportunity begin in the UK and Spain over 2 decades ago. We took advantage of that. We've built a capability across the UK and Europe, in Australasia, in North America, and more latterly we've been very interested in focusing in Latin America. And so that evolution has a lot to do with many things, but has a lot to do with what is, in your parlance, full frontal, and that is seeing the visibility, it's tautology, but the visibility of long-term pipeline of potential opportunity in the PPP space. Now, we see PPP being applied traditionally to social infrastructure, so some people talk about it in terms of social infrastructure. It's not always the case. I mean, whether a road is social or economic is an interesting debate to be had, and in my portfolio we invest in many road schemes as well. What is vital, though, for us in terms of the interest that I have and the capability that I've built up within Aberdeen Standard is what I term a long-term concession with a government or with a government agency who awards a contract to the private sector, generally for the design, build, finance, operate and maintain of strategic infrastructure of national importance. To date, I've invested in about 120 schemes globally, and again, that spans the regions that I talked about. In the previous panel, we talked about some of the other key ingredients like political stability and legal enforceability and frameworks. We can talk about the efficacy of those in Latin America in some more detail maybe a bit later. But that's my current interest, and although my organisation, as I said earlier, has something close to $1 trillion of potential money to invest around the world, my platform in that 20 years in the PPP space has only invested around about $4 billion US. So it's a very niche area. I have in the market, interestingly enough, in pure investment in PPP, it's a very limited number of organisations that just focus in that space. Most are more multidisciplinary and look at different facets of infrastructure. But we have a particular thesis and an understanding about the importance of being very focused in the infrastructure space. And the last point in my introduction I would make, I never see myself as an infrastructure specialist because there is no concept of infrastructure as an asset class, controversial in my view, because infrastructure is simply a suite of opportunities in which there are projects involving infrastructure, but the risk profile of those are often very different. That can range from something that looks more like fixed income to private equity, and I'm more interested in that fixed income space because over the last 20 years we've seen an explosion in cash, in the hands of pension funds, insurance companies and so on, institutional investors looking for a home to match their assets, which is why I've tried to concentrate in the space where I believe they're most interested, because that's what we as good investors should do. We should be responding to our clients, and our clients are looking for a long-term, stable, uncorrelated revenue flow to match their liabilities, and we see that coming out of, hopefully, the PPP space.
Thank you, Gershon. Ian Frederick from Invest Chile.
Well, good morning. Thank you very much. Thank you, Elijah, for the invitation to participate today with you. I am director for the Chilean government Foreign Investment Promotion Agency, Invest Chile, recently formed a couple of years ago. And my interest here today is on point one. This is a visit as part of a roadshow of foreign investment attraction that we're doing to Europe for the next week and a half. Next week we'll be visiting certain markets in economies in Europe with our Minister of Economy. The following week we're going to Asia with our Minister of Public Works and carrying a message of the opportunities that we have today in Chile in terms of infrastructure, in particular concessions under the PPP model. And that's my second interest, which is sharing a little bit of those opportunities here today with this audience. Chile has been for decades a very interesting economy, a small market, a small country, but a great economy as we see. And in many ways we have highlighted and we have been able to attract large amounts of foreign investment into several sectors and industries in our economy. Chile is not only about copper. Chile has today 25 years or so of large investments in infrastructure under a very successful PPP model, which has been key for the development of our economy, has been crucial into our business model. And but Chile has changed a lot. Chile is a very modern country today, has several opportunities across industries. We are exporting today some of the largest crystal lagoons and building 600 of those in 60 different countries. We have one of the most important airlines of Latin America, being a very small country like us. So we have a global services industry that is also become very attractive, and large companies, global multinational companies, establishing in Chile to operate across Latin America. So in several ways, this country has changed a lot. It has a lot of opportunities, and that's something that we're trying to carry on to promote more in events like this. So today, I'm happy to as the conversation goes, to expand a bit on the opportunities, specifically on the concessions portfolio that we have today, just being launched and publicly announced by our Public Works Ministry.
Thanks, Ian Frederick. And Graham Smith from HSBC.
Okay, well, my role in HSBC is to drive sustainable financing within the bank. A lot of that is linked to infrastructure. A lot of it is linked to cities in particular. I've done a lot of transport projects around Latin America. I think I've just been turned off. Hang on, I'll go with this. No, I haven't. I've done work in Brazil, in Chile, in Colombia, in Panama, and Mexico. And my experience of infrastructure in Latin America is that it doesn't always work. Sometimes you get concessions which are changed too often, which then start changing the risk parameters from what you went into finance to something very, very different. I would say that some countries are very good at obeying the spirit of the concession, even if not the exact words. But what I would say is Latin America needs to catch up. 80% of people in Latin America live in cities. That's more than you find in Europe or Asia. And when you consider that today, cities have got around about 50% of the global population and about 60% of global emissions, you have to make cities work. So the infrastructure's got to work, they've got to become more efficient, they've got to become more digital. So I actually think that Latin America is on a very interesting cusp. You've got more cities, more citizen cities than any other region of the world, and yet you're probably investing less in your cities per citizen than perhaps any other region. So that's got to change if you're to develop sustainably. It's got to change if you want the lives of people living in those cities to basically grow and for them to grow economically. So lots of opportunity, lots of challenges, and I think the way we look at it at HSBC, the only way to achieve it is going to be through tough love. Cities, governments, regions, being told what they need to do to bring in finance, what they need to do, to be successful. And I think that's probably the role of a global bank like HSBC. Talk about what we've seen, talk about the experiences, and talk about what we think needs to be done to make things happen.
Thank you. It's one of the themes that actually I want to return to is on technology and innovation, which we should, with the panel today, delve further into that because of the work that people have been doing in that sphere. But before we do, I quite like the idea of just exploring the different funding models. In the context of that, Fiona had in the initial introduction, had referred to a phrase of spectacular, steady but unspectacular growth, which may be unexciting for some, but in the infrastructural realm, it's music to ears because a stable environment economically allows for longer term planning in infrastructure. But coming back to the funding models, we have a range from intergovernmental discretionary funding in total. So a number of inward investments from foreign governments exclusively in roads, for instance, across to the establishment of quasi-governmental bodies providing minority funding and relying for majority private sector investment, coupled with other government bodies who wish to take a controlling interest. And in the context of infrastructure, I just wanted to invite views from the floor, or from the panel rather, as to what you prefer to see and the things particularly that you're looking for as part of your investment choice. Gershon, perhaps if I lead with you.
So the key thing that I look for are funding structures that are pertinent and appropriate to the underlying infrastructure. There are dangers all over the world where people have invested in infrastructure thinking it was a safe investment, only to find that the financial structure has made it rather risky. I was talking last week to some investors, and we were discussing what makes a quality investment in a listed company. And they asked me what I thought, and I said, well, maybe a UK regulated water company would be a quality investment. And they said, no, that's a value investment. The reason why it's no longer a quality investment is because many of those companies have huge levels of debt. So I think appropriate structures are important. My own interest, I'm actually an equity investor. So I am directly investing my institution's money in projects. So what's important to me is looking at the rest of the capital structure. So if we're looking at a long-term concession, then I'm interested in long-term forms of capital market products, debt and bonds. Now in Latin America, there are different terms that the banks are prepared to lend to. There are different criteria that the development banks are interested in. And so I think what we'll see, to try and match my view of what's appropriate, is a very mixed basket of funding products going into complex infrastructure solutions. I don't think there's going to be a one-size-fits-all, where, of course, pre-GFC, you would often see huge amounts of debt being loaded onto commercial and corporate banking balance sheets for 20, 30 years. We won't see that so much anymore because the rules and the global banking rules have changed, so they're unable to do that because the regulatory capital they would need to sustain that type of term would make it too expensive. So I think what we'll see is exactly what I said, something which is not necessarily a model that will be necessarily repeatable over time, but will evolve over time as lenders and investors and the bond markets get more familiar. I think in the short term, though, I would encourage a greater, and this is always an interesting dynamic for the private sector, but a greater involvement of the governments in some of the areas of financing where the capital markets are simply unable to participate because either the term, the risk, or the nature of what's required can't be bridged. And it may well be that in the short term you get a bridge from the government. However, if you go too far and you look at the government taking all the liabilities and standing behind all of those capital market and debt for financings, then actually it's not really worth investing necessarily in the project because there's no risk. Because often the government will end up guaranteeing everything, and that's not actually what I'm looking for. So I think what we would say, if I come back to appropriateness, it's a mix of what's available at the time, what help is required, and to work over a consistent period to get more people comfortable with the risks in projects so that the private markets can take more of that risk as they become more comfortable with it and price it appropriately. So I can't give you a straight answer as to what would be a perfect kind of solution for a particular type of project. I think it's going to evolve. But by the way, it's evolved elsewhere in the world as well. And post-GFC, we're seeing a multitude of changes. We're seeing new providers of debt. The insurance companies are now big providers of debt into projects. So being innovative and alive to the markets are very important. And that requires one important ingredient, which we may come back to, and that is very strong procuring expertise, particularly in partnerships where concessions are being awarded for infrastructure on the government side, so that they are as familiar with the financial landscape and the commercial landscape and the providers and the costs and the risks and so on of the private sector providers of financing as the private sector is, so that there is a meaningful discussion and we get appropriate structures for the word that was mentioned earlier, but in a slightly different context that I looked for to apply the word, which is sustainability for the project and the project program for the longer term.
Thank you. Graham?
Yeah, I would pick up on those points. I think quite often when I talk to cities and governments, what you say to them is just look at the whole project. So there'll be elements in there that only a government can do. perhaps they're so high risk or they're so key that someone's got to start the ball rolling. Maybe that's government. Maybe there's elements in there which are best for regional development banks. Maybe there's elements in there which are good for for green funds, and there's elements in there the private sector can do. But sometimes you say to them, just look at the project and work out this can be financed by the private sector, so I'm not going to use government funds for that. This bit can't be done by government because I don't have the knowledge of how to do, say, working capital facilities. This should maybe be done by the private sector. But you look at the project, so you start saying, well, okay, are we going to be importing goods or assets? Maybe that could be an export credit agency. Maybe we can look to have the Swedish government, the UK government, the Spanish government, the French government supporting that element. Maybe this project is particularly green. Maybe we can go to the Green Climate Fund. Maybe it's it links into the plans of CABE or the IFC for the region. And so do these things and work them out appropriately. And I'll give an example. I'll deliberately make this a non-Latin American example because that way I don't upset anybody, because I'm generally quite good at doing that. Malaysia. We went to a new city in Malaysia being designed to be built on the other side of the causeway from Singapore. Huge new development, part of the Malaysian government's 5-year plan. And we sat down with the authority, basically tasked with developing this new metropolis. And they said, well, we've looked at the financing, we've looked at the project, and we've worked out exactly what we need you to do. And we said, well, that's good because we're a major infrastructure bank. We've done this all around the world. So great, you've already worked out how our skills and our experience match your project. And yeah, we've decided that you will basically lend the money for the subsidy. So, well, hang on, just go back a bit. So where's your money going? So, our money, we're gonna put the infrastructure in place. We're going to buy buses because it's going to be a bus rapid transit system. But we actually want so many buses. We want them to flood the market so that all the people that don't travel on buses today, they will see there's so many buses, it's so logical that they should get out of their car and they should get on the bus instead. But obviously, because there aren't any passengers today, that's not sustainable. So what we thought you would do, you'd lend the money that covers all that missing fare revenue for hopefully in 3 years' time, passengers will get on. And we went, okay, should we just stop you where you are and just reverse it a bit? You do the subsidy, we'll do the buses, and then we'll together work out how we do the infrastructure. But you'd be surprised how many ministries and cities and governments have never actually looked at the total funding mix and worked out, hang on, what bit best goes where, and what do I need to amend to actually get myself the biggest access to that range of opportunities. And I think one thing that also you have to bear in mind, particularly in the Latin American context, is that although you've got people like Bancomex and Nafinsa in Mexico, you've got people like Findater and the FDN in Colombia, you've got people like the Berndt in Brazil, sometimes these are like elephants that basically trample other sources of finance under their feet. And the reason that there's not a well-developed project finance market in some of these countries is because the national entities have squashed out, frozen out, squeezed out, the opposition. So there is no other form of long-term financing. And that's really important because when you look at the way the world's going, $100 trillion of sustainable finance is needed for sustainable infrastructure by 2050. And they're reckoning that at least 33% of that must be done by the private sector. Latin America cannot afford not to have private sector players in the infrastructure space.
There's a theme with some London economics data to say that in this sector, the source of underinvestment was most pronounced. And so finding private sector investment is key to solving that and enhancing. In Frederick, coming back to your experience with Chile and dealing with PPP models and particularly concessions, is there preferred models that you're seeing coming through with projects that are on your portfolio?
Yes. Well, I think that Chile had to do this question to itself. Government did 30 years ago, exactly about should we be spending our money into infrastructure or do we have other priorities where we should invest on? And I think The example is at site. You can see how successful it has been after 25 years of great returns in the different industry sectors where Chile took this decision, which was basically allowing the private sector to come in with the funds and to grow some of these industries. The infrastructure in highways and now in hospitals is the PPP model, where privates basically build, operate, and transfer the assets back to government after the period of the concession. It has a very interesting rate of return. Today we're continuing on that direction. The model has proven to be successful. The level of interest that we see today, international, global players, for the next portfolio of investment is high. In industries like energy, the model is similar. Open tenders, where we have got today investments over $15–20 billion in the last 6 years. Implementing a whole transformation of the energy generation matrix in Chile, now moving strongly into renewable, non-conventional energies, and fully funded and fully driven by the private sector. So no subsidies at all, which is today one of probably one of the best cases worldwide in terms of industry development. In terms of the ports, same thing. In the 90s, Chile decided to privatize ports. Today, Chile is depending, it's an exporting country. We depend on the growth and development of our exports, and we have 10 ports across the country, and today it's fully driven by the private sector, and the large-scale investments that will come will continue to be on the hands of the private. So the government at the end has decided to provide the right conditions for that investment to grow and to have a good return, providing the political stability, providing a good capital market to continue to develop, to be best class, to be world open. So regulatory frameworks, of course, and it has been said, all countries have a lot to do in all these matters, but probably what Chile has to do is to continue to refine some of these elements, but the business model continues to go in the direction of private sector to drive the growth and development in infrastructure in all of these areas and industries.
Thank you. Andrew, just in connection with your advisory role, both for governments and for private sector, what are some of the factors that you're taking into account on the various funding models?
Most of our advice is to, I would guess, to well-established US and European funds. We are always looking on their behalf at the risk profile, predominantly through the physical models, I guess, that we're looking at, not just in terms of the actual infrastructure that's being promoted, but the usage of them in the future. And so we steer clear of advice on financial matters. That's, we're not qualified for that, but we tend to provide some thoughts on what future scenarios may be taking shape. And of course, one of the big challenges at the moment in terms of making forecasts for, say, for instance, toll roads, is the impact that autonomous vehicles, whether they're freight vehicles or passenger vehicles for people, what impact that's going to have on existing assets that are owned by portfolios or within portfolios, or for investors who are trying to buy those or invest in them. So, our role is fairly niche in that sense, but it's becoming quite challenging in terms of making sure that investors and those divesting of assets are fully aware of the upsides and downsides that are likely to exist as we move forward.
Thank you, Andrew. I was just wondering whether there were hands from the floor at this point in time. Ramin.
Hi. My question is, given the fact that debt and borrowing is a very important part of any investment funds, and given the fact that Basel III comes to to force very shortly. And looking at the white paper on Basel IV, it looks far more dramatic. What is the willingness of the bank actually to do real lending to larger projects?
Yeah, it's a very interesting point. Basel III sank one of the ideas that quite a few of the banks had, which was to develop a sort of an entity that would actually help make projects bankable, reach down into the pipeline, get projects into a bankable stage, and then pass them out to the financing and banking community. But then Basel III came in, and the banks realised that if you put equity into an entity like that, which is not really, it's more like a consultancy than a typical bank, they would have to actually they'd be really penalised. It was like 3 times the amount of capital that you invest. So Basel III has had some bad effects. I think one of the things that may be interesting is that there's a lot of discussion going on around the moment around this idea of a green supporting factor. And what this is saying is that you need to lower the risk rating of assets which are sustainable. And so you encourage banks to lend because they need less capital. You encourage them to lower pricing because the risk rating is lower. I think that you're right. Right now, banks are sort of saying, I'd rather do maybe 3, 4, 5 years and then pass it out to refinancing, perhaps to the capital markets, perhaps to investors directly. I think the difference that will come is that if we put in a green supporting factor, and it will probably be around infrastructure, probably around green buildings, very possibly around renewable energy, to encourage banks to lend, I think that's when the banks will start saying, actually, I'll go longer term, because I'm not being penalised on my use of capital. But I think that green supporting factor is going to be really important. The problem is a lot of regulators are saying, well, maybe you should have a brown punishing factor. And other regulators are saying, well, if we did have a green supporting factor, how do we know that you'll do any more green business? We've given you the Christmas present, but how do we know, that it will actually be of any use? Well, my personal view would be, you never know until you try. And we had a small business supporting factor a number of years ago, after 2008, which did not require a lot of hand-wringing. It was basically felt it's necessary to make sure the banks support. So I think the secret is going to be a green supporting factor. I think that's the key.
Can I give perhaps just add to the comments that I agree with and expand just a little bit more? I'm actually a big supporter of Basel III and the white paper on Basel IV. I think the maximum stability you can get in the worldwide banking system, the better for everybody. The problem is, as you highlighted, it reduces the capacity of the banks to lend long. The question you should then ask is, why should the banks lend long? At the end of the day, you should lend in appropriate measure to the assets that you have. If you're going to take long-term liabilities, you should have long-term assets. And of course, banks don't typically have long-term assets. And so I actually think what it'll do, it'll partly focus the banks very, very in a much more deliberate way in areas that we've just mentioned, but also to areas that they used to be much more capable of, which was construction and development lending. And the natural home for the long-term takeout for these long-term infrastructure projects would certainly be the sort of insurance and pension fund market, which do have long-term, very long-term need to have assets to match their long-term liabilities, but they're also constrained in what they can provide. And so one would hope over time, and post the financial crisis, if you remember, all the rage were people talking about debt funds and creating vehicles through which banks could come in to the infrastructure market in a slightly different fashion. I think that will continue to evolve, and I think the pressure that builds up as a result of things like Basel III, Basel IV, and so are probably quite good, because the capital markets are very good at innovating, but when they don't have to innovate, they don't. They're quite lazy, and so they sort of fall back to their practices. And I don't think I want to see big banks around the world like HSBC and so on lending 25 and 30 years. I don't think that's what they're good at doing, to be perfectly honest. I think they're much better in terms of corporate lending and development risk and analysis, whereas there are other institutions that would be best placed to provide that long-term capital. And I'm hoping that the market continues to evolve. And the development banks have a role in that, because the development banks aren't really as constrained as the commercial banks. So they can perhaps bridge the period through which the innovation is being developed so that actually we can make some progress in a steady, cautious way, in the hope that I think that there have become deeper markets of other providers than simply looking to the banking world.
Thank you.
Thank you. This is perhaps a question for Andrew, but the panel mentioned the proportion of Latin Americans living in cities. I wonder if you have an assessment of what appetite there is for and how viable would be what we might call smart city projects, new transport infrastructure, innovative connectivity and so on.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, I think there are several challenges that confront the region. As has been mentioned, a very large proportion of citizens living in urban developed areas, and most of those focused around the coastlines as well. And of course, with climate change, that's going to present certain problems to large numbers of people. So I think my experience of working around the globe is that identifying the opportunity, there's been a lot of focus over the last 20 or 30 years in terms of creating more sustainable infrastructure platforms for cities, whether it's energy, water, waste, transport. And you sort of get to a bit of the law of diminishing returns. You put an awful lot of effort into those, and you only get so much return. I think that's the reason I've been quite interested in how infrastructure can, digital and smart systems, technology can play a role in helping to move a further step forward. So we've been looking more closely at the integration of infrastructure, different systems, and of course the key asset that plays a role in that is technology, the data streams that actually link transport systems, that link power systems, that link water systems. The nirvana that everyone's in the tech world is pushing towards is trying to get those to work in an integrated fashion, a common platform, another infrastructure platform, an urban operating system, if you would, to help to manage on a much better level the flow of resources. So I think that's one key issue. The big challenge, of course, is that unlike most of the historic infrastructure that cities have, which, as other panelists have mentioned, have probably design lives of 4, 5, 10 years, and serviceable lives of 50 to 100 years. You're talking about, in technology terms, you can start talking weeks, and so the challenge is there's the equal challenge of the timeframes that you're working over. You're working across those spans and having to work out what is achievable and that's not going to be obsolete in 10 years' time to help promote the advances in cities. It's exciting times. I think everyone's aware of the potential for automated vehicle that automated vehicles has for transforming the way people use cities and how cities function. And we shouldn't forget it's probably only a little over a century ago that the petrol-driven vehicle started hitting the city streets in Europe and the States. And if I would suggest the lack of ability to look forward and understand the impact that they were going to have on future generations is something that we mustn't miss in terms of the advent of automated vehicles. And there's very little work being put in at the moment, I would suggest, into thinking about the regulatory and fiscal conditions that need to exist to make sure that we're not going to end up with even more traffic on our roads because it simply is more convenient and easy and possibly more cost effective, and that movements the movement that it will allow, that the freedom it will give people, that is actually helpful both to cities and to citizens, and I think that comes down to a bit of thought going in now. But it does give, I think, hope and a lot of opportunity for, let's say, Latin American leaders to start to think they're in the game with the rest of the world in terms of thinking about the future and being able to transform their cities now to give them an economic edge, I would suggest.
I offer granted.
Yeah, I would say smart cities development is key for Latin America. I think there's some figures out there that say that about 25% of the Latin American urban population live in slums, which is something like 160 million people. So when we look at smart cities, we say, yep, they've got to be smart, they've got to be connected, but they've also got to be resilient and livable, because as you get more and more people flooding into cities, the city has to be able to basically take those numbers, and that's transport, that's water, that's sewage, that's all these things. And and for Latin Americans to be a big issue, what you tend to see about the age group between 25 and 35 are the ones that move fastest to cities, and that's the Latin American age group. Every week, 1 million people move into a city somewhere in the world. That's more than the population of Birmingham. Now, Latin America's actually got that exacerbated because you've got that age group, and you've got those cities as a huge pull factor, and I think those cities have got to grow smartly. They've got to grow more resiliently, and it can be lots and lots of different things. I think it's going to be public transport. It's going to be greener buildings. It's going to be better use of air conditioning and more energy efficiency. I think it's going to be those things are the first things to do. Autonomous vehicles, I think, will come much later. I think for Latin America, there's other things that need to be done first. But I think, it's got to be smart development. The Chinese and the Belt and Road are already saying all the development on the Belt and Road must be smart and sustainable. Latin America needs to be starting to say the same things, because you're going to have so much pressure on the cities, and you've got to get that planning, that delivery right, because the consequences, if not, they'll be unforgivable. So I think smart cities is absolutely a must for Latin America. The downside is the way that city mayors want to make decisions, so the things that are delivered during their tenure, and very rarely are they willing to see something that they start be delivered in the tenure of their successor. And that is a big issue if you're trying to do metros, if you're trying to do light rails. A lot of these projects will not be delivered during the tenure of one mayor, so he'll be thinking, why would I want to do it? So there's a political angle to smart cities development that you cannot ignore.
I believe we have time for one more question from the floor. Thank you.
Hi, thanks. Hi there. It's not really a question, it's just a reminder. I'm Steve Crosley from UK Export Finance, and I just thought it was worth pointing out briefly that the department does come under the umbrella of the Department of International Trade. We are extremely interested in providing support, and that support is based on support for UK exporters in terms of their own exports to Latin America, but also to overseas buyers in Latin America. Quite a lot of publicity about the market appetite we have for the region, and extremely interested in getting involved in the large infrastructure projects. The way it works is basically we provide, as Graham would know probably, we provide guarantees via a bank to allow long-term loans to be provided to overseas buyers who basically, provided they're looking at the UK for their construction projects or whatever, then we're happy to provide that loan, and that loan will be over a long period of time. So we'd love to get into some of the markets much more than we are, trying to get round with a bit more publicity. So today's event, fantastic.
There are double-decker buses driving around Mexico City today due to UKF support. Done with the wrong bank, I have to say, but still done.
We work with any bank, so provided they're okay.
Okay, listen.
Thanks.
Thank you from the floor, and for the other questions as well. We have unfortunately run out of time now for this session, but I think one of the takeaways is that these are profound questions, and they're profound questions that are affecting not only the people in this room, but also the governments that are here today and the governments of tomorrow. And I believe that some of the messaging that should be continuing to go back is that these are hard decisions, but ones that are necessary for the future of not only the nations, but also the region generally. I wanted to take this opportunity to thank each of the panel members for their time and efforts today, and from those from the floor who have either spoken or listened intently. We're very grateful. Thank you very much.